Dana?
Thank you for joining Tel Aviv University's webcast on the outcomes of the 2013 Israeli elections. I would like to apologize on behalf of Professor Yossi Shane, who was called away unexpectedly and could not join us today. Dr. Udi Sommer of Tel Aviv University's Department of Political Science will be our first speaker. He has written extensively on political institutions and the evolution of the legal system. Today he will be talking about Israeli elections to the 19th Knesset and Israeli society. This will be followed by a short presentation by myself, Dr. Tal Sadeh, head of the Hartog School of Government and Policy in Tel Aviv University. I specialize in the European Union politics, and I will discuss Israeli-European relations. At the bottom of the webcast page, you will find a chat box. You're invited to write questions, and we will try to respond to these during the program. Please feel free to identify yourself and the organization you represent. And with that, I give the floor to Dr. Sommer.
Thank you, Dr. Sadeh. So hello to everyone overseas. So I'm going to talk about the Israeli elections to the 19th Knesset and Israeli society. And I'll try to discuss how changes in Israeli society are reflected in the new political order that is taking shape as we speak, in fact. I'll talk about three key trends. The first one is about the population age structure of Israeli society. Israeli society is a substantially young society, and I will link it to the protest movement of the summer of 2011, 18 months ago, and to the centrality of centrist parties and how powerful they have become in the elections 2 days ago. The second trend will be about immigration from the former Soviet Union, and I will raise the question about whether what we saw in the election outcomes 2 days ago is a reflection of a certain level of integration into Israeli society. And lastly, I will talk about our minority, and there I will talk about a change in society, a demographic change, which is hardly reflected in the political clout of the parties representing this constituency, and I'll shortly discuss why that is the case. So let us start with the first topic, the population age structure, the protests of last summer, or 2 summers ago, in fact, and the power of centrist parties. So as you can see in this figure, on the x-axis here are the years with projections for 2020 and 2030, and the figures are the population size. So as you can see, Israeli society is a rapidly growing society. It is 2.5 times larger today than it was when I was born, and hopefully you can tell that this wasn't too long ago. So it is growing at a very rapid pace. But on top of that, it is expected to keep growing that way, and this is largely due to the age structure of the population. So on the figure here, you have Israel on the right-hand side and Switzerland on the left-hand side. These are 2 countries with largely the same population size, slightly under 8 million citizens. On the x-axis are numbers in hundreds of thousands, and on the y-axis are the age groups of the population. And as you can see on the right-hand side, Israeli society is an extremely young society, especially compared to European countries such as Switzerland, where the age groups of 35 to 55 or so are the dominant groups. Now, this age structure means that the needs of Israeli citizens are around issues, as reflected in the protest movement of last summer, are around needs related to child care, affordable housing, and these are also needs that have been articulated quite clearly by centrist parties in those elections, and particularly by the what has been dubbed as the big winner of those elections, which is Yesh Atid, a party led by a former TV anchor, Yair Lapid. So let us look at how those demographic facts are reflected in the new political landscape. So in this slide, on the left-hand side are the results of the two, I will call them centrist parties, although I'll take it back in a few minutes. The two centrist parties in the 18th Knesset, which was elected 4 years ago in 2009. And on the right hand, you have the results for the centrist parties in the 19th Knesset in 2013, 2 days ago. Now, the reason why I said I'm going to take that back is that the Labor Party in 2009 was not necessarily identified as a centrist party, but it was reformulated almost as a centrist party by its new leader, and this is why it appears as a centrist party on the right-hand side. Now, what you can see is that the total number of representatives that went to centrist parties in 2009 was essentially 28, although you could or could not count the Labor, and it is well over 40 in the current elections. And there are at least four parties that think of themselves as centrist parties. And probably the most interesting comparison here would be between Yesh Atid and Hatnuah. So these are two centrist parties whose agenda for the elections was quite different. So Yesh Atid ran on the agenda of the protest movement of the summer of 2011, where the issues such as affordable housing and affordable childcare were central to the messages that they had for the public. Conversely, Hatnuah, which was led by former Minister of Foreign Affairs Tzipi Livni, ran on quite a different agenda. For her, the main issue was a peace settlement and a resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And at least as far as the election outcomes are concerned, it's quite clear that Yesh Atid had an argument that was appealing to a larger constituency, and this is why, as I mentioned earlier, they are considered as the big winners, the big gainers at least. Definitely they didn't win the elections, but they gained substantially in this election round. The next topic is immigration from the Soviet Union. Now we'll raise the question about whether what we see here is a story of integration. So just to give you, again, a few numbers, so we're all on the same page. This is immigration to Israel over the last 20 years, from 1990 to 2009. And as you can see here on the left-hand side, this is the major immigration wave of the early 1990s, right after the end of the Cold War. So if you think about the very first figure, the country is about 4 million, has about 4 million citizens. In those first 2 or 3 years, it has an addition of about 10% of its size in terms of immigrants. This large immigration wave tapers off in the late 1990s and essentially diminishes during the 2000s. You can see 80% of the immigrants here, so it's 1.25 million immigrants between 1990 and 2009. 80% of those were immigrants from the former Soviet Union. And the interesting thing is that, so this is interesting in its own right, but if you look at the next slide, you can see that during the early 1990s, if you look at, so what you have in this figure is the population growth, or the sources of population growth. On the top, the purple part of the column is population growth stemming from immigration, and the rest is in blue. And as you can see, population growth in the early 1990s was largely accounted for by this immigration that we saw in the previous slide. And this again tapers off in the late 1990s as essentially becomes about around a little over 10% in the 2000s. Now the parties, if we think about how this change in Israeli society is translated into political reality, there have been parties since the mid-1990s that identified themselves as representing the Russian quote-unquote constituency, or the constituency of those who immigrated from the former Soviet Union. If we look at their clout over the years, we'll see that they are considerably they're not as strong as you would expect, and when they do become strong is when they try to appeal to a larger constituency, when they reach out beyond their basic constituency of the population of the immigrants from the former Soviet Union. So if you look at the next figure, what you have here are the power of immigrant parties over the years in the last 6 election cycles. And as you can see, they had about 6 representatives in 1996, 10 representatives in 1999, and when they're starting to gain momentum, it's in 2006 and 2009, and to a large extent what they had in the elections 2 days ago, where they, under the leadership of Avigdor Lieberman, are trying to appeal to a larger audience. Their agenda is not necessarily focused on the needs of their constituency. They're still dubbed or still identified as the quote-unquote Russian parties, or Russian party in singular, but it is when they try to appeal to this larger audience when they are able to gain momentum in terms of political clout, and they're merging with the Likud 2 months and a half ago, right after the elections were announced, or the dissolution of parliament and the elections were announced, is I think in a sense a symbol of the fact that this constituency does not exist as such, okay? Especially given the fact that the big waves were about 20 years ago, and you have a second generation, etc. So it is true that the immigrants from the former Soviet Union tend to vote for this party. About 40% of them, according to studies, vote for this party, but it is probably largely due to the right-wing agenda that this party represents, rather than its identification as a Russian quote-unquote party. And lastly, the Arab constituencies. Okay, in this constituency, we see a major demographic growth, which is expected to, given the very young age structure of this group, to grow even more dramatically in coming years. But due to low to very low turnout, this has not been translated into political clout. So in this figure, we have the ethnic groups in Israeli population over the years. The turquoise on the bottom is Jewish population, and the purple at the top is the Arab population. So as you can see, in the early 1990s, okay, if you remember the figure earlier, which showed the immigration in the early 1990s, despite this immigration, despite about an immigration wave of over 500,000 in a matter of 3 to 4 years, and this immigration wave was larger, but part of it was later in the 1990s, okay, still you see that the Arab constituency in the early 1990s is slightly under 20%, and it grows to around 20% in Israeli society today. If you look at how this is not translated into the political clout, you see that Arab parties over the years, and here again you have the last 6 election cycles, and these are all the Arab parties, or what are identified as Arab parties combined, although they do have Jews who vote for them. You see that they hardly ever pass. They hover around the number 10 in terms of 10 representatives out of 120 Knesset members, but not more than that. So with this, I will conclude, and we'll have Professor Sadeh have his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Udi. I will now briefly review the framework that has evolved for Israel's relation with the European Union over the years. Israel and the European Union have a free trade association agreement since 1975. In 1995, following the launch of the Barcelona process, that is the new policy of the European Union towards the Mediterranean, Israel and the European Union signed an upgraded association agreement, which, on top of the existing free trade area, added political and cultural cooperation, as well as, and that was special for Israel, cooperation in research and development. In fact, Israel was the only country that is not a member of the European Union, but still takes part in the research and development projects of the European Union. Then, in 2003, the European Union launched a new version, or a new generation, if one would have it, of its Mediterranean policy when it launched the European Neighborhood Policy. In fact, that was not really a Mediterranean policy because it also included in it the Ukraine, Moldova. It included countries such as Azerbaijan and Armenia and Georgia. But following that new policy, Israel and the European Union signed an action plan in 2004 that ran its course by 2007. And that action plan, again, contributed to more economic integration between Israel and the European Union. Israel was the first Mediterranean, or actually any neighborhood country, to sign such a plan. It was quick to implement it, so much so that by 2007 negotiations began on a second action plan. The only country within that group of countries that had such a negotiation. But because of the political situation in 2008, the European Parliament, which is an institution inside the European Union, has decided to freeze these negotiations, and the second action plan was never signed until this date, although some agreements have been signed, such as an open skies agreement, an agricultural agreement, as well as some standards recognition agreements. Throughout these years, Israel has always complained, the Israeli government, but also people in academic institutions in Israel, that the European Union fails to utilize the potential that is there in what could be Israeli-European relations because of its insistence of balancing whatever it does with Israel in regional contexts, especially balancing it with agreements it has with Arab countries, lest it be seen as too pro-Israeli. As a result, repeatedly Israel has had to be categorized as if it is an Arab country, a developing country, another poor Middle Eastern country, when clearly it was not, and ever more so with time. Israel by now is an OECD country, but still is treated by the European Union as just another Middle Eastern country. There are institutional reasons for that. The European Union does not like to give specific policies to specific countries. They tend to categorize all the countries in the world into different classes with which the European Union deals. Normally they would have a general framework policy for such a group. It could be the poor countries, it could be European non-member countries, etc. And so Israel just happens to be in the Middle East, and that's where regarded. Israeli government would like Israel to be regarded as another Switzerland, in that it becomes a category unto itself, but there has been no progress in this regard. The European Union on its side, and I should stress that the European Union is not a monolith. There are different organizations inside there. I mentioned the European Parliament, which is directly elected in Europe and is very sensitive to public opinion. There's also the Council of Ministers, which is more an intergovernmental body, a bit like the UN, where governments haggle and bargain. But and there are, of course, the nation states, the government, the member states of the European Union have their own bilateral relations with Israel. But the European Union has a common foreign and security policy, and ever since the early 1970s, it tries hard to have a coherent policy. It generally is successful in being coherent when it comes to Israel. Normally, the European countries do not like to break ranks in their dealings with Israel. They do that over war and peace questions, such as Iraq, Bosnia, and other places. That's where they have had a harder time in agreeing on common policy and following on it. But with Israel, somehow they feel that they can manage one line on Israel. And that line is that Israel should resolve its conflict with the Palestinians. The Arab states should recognize Israel. There should be two states. And that Israel should evolve as a secular, democratic country with values that are similar to those of the European Union. And here is the clash, because in Israel there has been never a separation of religion and state, whereas the European Union, although it does have some member states that are very religious, such as Poland or Malta or Ireland, it has the main member states of the European Union generally, if not legally, in practice at least, follow a very secular policy, and especially their foreign policies and their security policies are not shaped by religion. And that is in stark contrast to Israel. Even people in Israel who regard themselves as secular base their identity on the Holy Bible. And so Israel is not ever quite really divorced from religion in this sense. And for as long as Israel was recognized to be based on a Zionist labor movement in its early years, that was tolerated and accepted and recognized by the European Union in its early stages. But ever since the 1980s and further, as Israel has increasingly been understood to be more a religious project than a secular project, the European Union has grown disenchanted with Israel and felt ever diverged from the values that people in Israel hold dear. That, I should stress, has never detracted from the European Union's commitment to the right of Israel to exist. But again, it kept putting the relations in the icebox. In periods when this has changed, were periods where the Israeli government seemed to lean more in the direction that Europe liked. For example, the 1990s, as I mentioned, the Barcelona process and the upgraded agreement with Europe followed on the Oslo process. And the action plan was less a response to an Israeli government more to the liking of the European Union, but certainly the disengagement from Gaza followed and was seen by the European Union as a move in the right direction. What to make of the Israeli elections and how they affect this situation? Well, if to speculate, I should say that the likeliest coalition, as far as I can tell at this evening, is that Lapid and Netanyahu and the Beit HaYehudi, the settlers' party, will form a coalition. This is because it is what we call in political science the minimum winning coalition. That is, it's the coalition that is based on the smallest number of parties and the smallest number of seats needed to retain a majority in the legislature. Coalitions that consist of more than the minimum required number of parties or seats tend to be more fragile, less stable. And so Israel's best hope, if one puts aside ideology, its best hope for a stable government lies with the triangle of Netanyahu, Lapid, and Beit Yehudi. This is also a coalition, numbers aside, and putting ideology back in. This is also the coalition that has less friction than any other coalition you can think of, because generally speaking, Lapid does not belong to the left. It's convenient for Netanyahu to have Lapid on his left and the Beit Yehudi on his right, so that Netanyahu never shows as a radical, but rather as a moderator. If he ditched Beit Yehudi, he would be the right-winger in any coalition, which would be less comfortable for him and would not necessarily allow him to present himself as a national centrist leader. So again, Lapid, Netanyahu, and Beit Yehudi are very comfortable coalition for Netanyahu. There are no economic disagreements among these parties, so Netanyahu can pursue his policies and economics unchanged as well. And so from foreign and security point of view and from economics point of view, I do not expect any change in the Israeli policy following these elections, which means that the Israeli-European relations will remain practically in the icebox for the foreseeable future. I should say that European policymakers are very pragmatic. At no point is there any serious suggestions. There are always wild suggestions at the fringes, but at no point is there any mainstream suggestion that trade links between Israel and the European Union should be severed, that Israeli goods should be boycotted. The discussion, the conflict, the trade conflicts that Israel and the European Union have had over the years were over goods originating in the settlements, which Israel demanded be recognized as Israelis and therefore eligible to the various tax exemptions, custom tariff exemptions, according to the agreements. And the European Union, of course, refused to recognize them as Israelis. But as I said, there is no progress in deepening the integration, but there is no falling back. There's no going back on any of these things. And so the price, from the Israeli government's point of view, the price of pursuing its current foreign and security policy is not very high at all. Europe, for all its words and unsympathetic commentary to Israel, does not really impose any major costs. It's just a potential that goes unfulfilled over the years, but possibly at some point there could be some change in Israeli policy and so better relations with the European Union. I will stop here because I may have talked too much for now, and we can always go back to it. Udi, I think we should fill in for Yossi, who, as I said earlier, could not join us, and say a few words about how we think the Israeli elections are going to affect Israel's relations with the United States. I have some of my own thoughts, but I will break now and give you the microphone to make some comments.
Why don't I let you articulate your thoughts first?
All right, I'll start with my thoughts. Neither do I. This is totally from my sleeve. But I think one of the, and again, I'm speaking only for myself, so this is not necessarily representative of the university or of any other institution, but I think one of the interesting developments in Israeli-American relations over the past few years has been the way in which Israel has gone from being a bipartisan issue in the United States and become one of the dividing issues between Republicans and Democrats. I should qualify this statement. In the end, Democrats, or at least the Jews among the Democrats, but also many other Democrats, are, I would say, even deeply sympathetic to Israel. They still think that Israel is a fulfillment of the Jewish right for national self-determination, and as such is legitimate. But they, as in the case of the European Union, are increasingly unhappy with the direction in which Israel is developing. For the Republicans, not all of them, but important parts of the Republican Party, precisely this direction in which Israel is progressing makes it closer to their own values. Of course, there are very few Jews among the Republican Party's people, if only because the Jews make up a very small part of American society, but also because we know that they tend to vote Democrat. So it's not the Jewish values that are appealing to Republicans in America, but it is because many Christians, devout Christians among the Republicans, see Israel as part of a religious process, a divine process that will allow some of their own belief to come true. I'm not very strong on Christian theology, so I'm not going to risk by detailing this plan, but it fits with their worldview. And so it's a divine thing, Israel. And so the more belligerent or assertive the Israeli settlers are vis-a-vis the Palestinian population, the better for some people in the Republican Party. They do not like the Oslo agreements. They do not like the idea of a Palestinian state, which is not holy in their view. And so they're basically are in agreement with the Likud and with Beit Yehudi on this. And this has been driven not least by Netanyahu's long-standing project of gaining support in America for the settlement movement and against a Palestinian state. He is able to raise donations there, and most importantly, is assured by a very assertive group in the American Congress that basically backs many of his policies, so much so that even President Obama is not really in a position to lean too hard on Netanyahu. And because this has become such, as I said, such a dividing issue, I'm not saying in the same league as gun control and abortions and the death penalty, but not very far below these in terms of intensity of the debate. It's basically very difficult for friends of Israel in the United States to effectively criticize the Israeli government and to bring any pressure to bear from the American government on Israel. This may change under a different president, perhaps, but for the next 4 years, with the new Israeli prime minister and a new American president, this is what we expect, and the Israeli elections, therefore, is expected, if my analysis is correct, to enhance these developments, and this is what I expect. This is what we can expect in the foreseeable future. Do you agree?
I will add a few thoughts. So, in his ambitious plan for his second term in office, President Obama listed quite a few issues, but I don't think Israel was not mentioned, and I don't think it ranks very highly on his agenda. And it has to do, obviously, with changes in America. So it's true that at least some of the recent presidents in their second term had the tendency of taking up the issue of the Arab-Israeli conflict. President Clinton, in his attempt in Camp David, President Bush in Annapolis, none of them bear the fruit that those presidents had expected. But I think in this case, the fact that Israel would not rank very highly on the agenda of the president has more to do with America than with Israel. So America has its clear challenges. I mean, if you just think about if Chuck Hagel is appointed president is appointed, he will have the task of dealing with a budget crisis in the Pentagon, which is related to the fiscal crisis that America is experiencing. There is issues, there is changes in the geostrategic interests in the Middle East, especially related to energy policy. The fact that America, given recent technological advancement, is expected to be much more independent, or much more not dependent on oil from the Middle East, means that and the fact that American capabilities, given the fiscal crisis, will be limited. I think the level of interests and of the current administration would be relatively limited. I might be proven wrong, and President Obama might follow in the footsteps of his two predecessors, and will try in his second term to bring the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to an end, but it's not quite clear to me that will be the case. And I think, and I agree with Tal, that if there is this minimum winning coalition that that Professor Sadeh outlined, having Lapid on the left hand, Likud in the center, and Habayit Yehudi on the right, this kind of coalition will deal mostly with domestic Israeli issues. It is unlikely to be able to make major progress in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't think it even pretends to have such intentions. Of course, in politics we might have surprises, but if this kind of coalition is able to make progress, it's on the domestic front as far as the Haredi or the ultra-Orthodox group is concerned, around questions about the allocation of budgetary resources, etc., more than around the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And if this is the case, then this also works in the same direction as the constraints or the changes on the American side to lead to, I think, less involvement of America in the Arab-Israeli conflict, or specifically in the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
Udi, let me be a bit provocative and ask you, do you think that the Lapid party is sort of the Israeli Tea Party?
I think, at least as far as the ideological spectrum is concerned, it is probably the exact opposite. So if the Tea Party was a group that was trying to push the Republican Party as right as to the conservative end as much as possible, and probably the elections in November reflected the fact that it was maybe too far to the right, at least as far as the American people is concerned. I think the Lapid, the Yesh Gvul, or the Yesh Atid, party, the Lapid party, as I mentioned earlier, this is a centrist party. They work, if you mentioned the minimum winning coalition, we can talk about the median voter theorem, another key theorem in political science. And in a nutshell, this theorem says that if you want to win, you got to cater to the needs of the median voter, because since the distribution of voters is generally a normal distribution, this is where most voters are. And I think this is what he was trying to do. So in this sense, I think the Tea Party is a great example for the exact opposite of what Lapid was trying to do in those elections.
I understand what you're saying, and it makes a lot of sense, but consider this. How about if we redefine what we consider to be right or left wing? In other words, what is the axis on which right and left run? In the United States, this is mostly about liberal versus conservative values in society, as I mentioned some of the main points of conflict earlier, and on that count, the Tea Party is a right-wing party. In Israel, you are judged to be right or left based on your attitude towards the territories, and less on economic issues. And so what passes for Israeli left is often made of some people who are socially, some of them, quite conservative, and some people who are on the Israeli right would then be very liberal in other ways, economically, etc. So I think the Lapid party is considered center on the issue of the territories. But what it really is asking for is a redivision of the national pie away from the poor people and onto the middle class. They want lower taxes and less welfare, in essence. And in that sense, I thought there's some similarity. The interesting thing here is that their main agenda is directed towards the ultra-Orthodox, which are, of course, a major part of the poor people in Israel. Israel often has statistics that show it to be a poorer country than many secular people experience in their lives, because they count in the Arab and the ultra-Orthodox populations, which aren't as well integrated into the economy and society as the rest of the population. Now, Lapid is in a position, of course, to enact legislation, perhaps a historical opportunity from his point of view, to enact legislation that would force the ultra-Orthodox to join the military, to be drafted. That's what he calls sharing the burden, shivyon banetel. It is interesting to find whether the ultra-Orthodox will go along this change. Some of them, we are told, are actually anxious for change. They want a new deal with the State of Israel, and they're willing to do some kind of service, if not military, then other civilian community service. And some of them are desperate to find a job because they are sick of a life of poverty. Perhaps. There's also a possibility that this will backfire, that is, that the ultra-Orthodox will not cooperate. They will refuse to be drafted. You will have to drag them, to imprison them, and you will find that the enforcement cost of this law is so huge that it's basically impractical. Not to mention that at some extreme point, this could be also portrayed as persecution of a minority, that you are forcing them to do something that is basically against their true way of life. So, to the extent, I mean, there is, from his point of view, some risk that all this will in the end boil down to nothing, of course.
Yeah. So judging on the on past attempts to do that, it might boil down to nothing. I think the sharing of the burden is possibly the one key front where this government could make progress. And sharing of the burden pertains to military service, as you mentioned, which has been mentioned as one of a plethora of issues in the protests of the summer of 2011. But I think the more critical issue here is participation in the workforce, which you briefly mentioned. I think that and in this sense, I'm not sure that I could judge the Lapid party as either right wing or left wing, because I'm not sure that there is quite an equivalent in that many Western countries where you have a population that is exempt from national service as military service in Israel and is exempt from participating in the workforce and gets the support from the country. So in this sense, and I think, and the interesting thing here is that both Lapid and the Likud and even Bennett, which is the Abait Yehudi, had this on their party platform. So for them, for Bennett, although he's Orthodox religious, he is not the ultra-Orthodox, and for him, having the ultra-Orthodox group being integrated into society, both in the military service, but again more dominantly as a part of the workforce, is important. I think if we think about this issue or we think about the future or the forming coalition with this issue in mind, I think we should draw a distinction between the two subgroups of the ultra-Orthodox constituency, and these are the Ashkenazim and the Mizrahim, or the Shas party, which represents the Mizrahim, and the party representing the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox. And I think the difference here is that the Shas party, with its leaders, particularly Deri, I think there is a willingness or there's an openness for change. Partly because this constituency has seen some of this change already, and also because I think generally in terms of their worldview, they would be open to such change. So in this sense, if they are able to if it's not a minimum winning coalition, but if it's a minimum winning coalition plus Shas, the Mizrahi ultra-Orthodox party, then we might be able to, or the country might be able to circumvent the kind of implementation issues that you mentioned. Because if there is cooperation on this issue with representatives of this constituency, and the policy and the legislation that is passed and the policy that is made are done with sufficient sensitivity to the needs and to the constraints that those people, the people who live that way, or I won't say constraints, to the kind of the sensitivity that is required when dealing with people who live with a different, based on different values, or at least somewhat different values. So if such legislation, if such policy is made with the sufficient sensitivity, and this might be possible with the Shas party as a part of the coalition, I think the country might be able to make progress on this issue, which is, I think, at least one of the only issues that a large share of the population would agree that is critical to the future of the country. So,
okay, let's take your suggestion that Netanyahu managed to put Shas and Lapid together. I have my doubts on this because I regard these two parties to be anathema one to the other, but from Netanyahu's point of view, it would be great if he could play the both against each other in this coalition and again appear as the broker of peace within his coalition. But then we know from past experiences, and Ariel Sharon, when he was prime minister, was a wizard of such coalition tactics and politics. This gets you about a year down the road. And at that point, something happens. The two parties can no longer put up with each other, and one of them quits. Okay? And then what? I've been toying with the idea that at some point Labor would join. Sheli Yachimowicz made it very clear that she wants to promote workers' rights, and that in order to achieve this, she's not going to make an issue out of settlements, the Palestinian peace process, all that. She put that aside. And possibly after the best coalition that he could ask for crumbles, Netanyahu has to ask for the support of Labor in order to keep his government a year or two hence. And do you think this could happen, that Netanyahu will say, because for him that's the swallowing a mighty frog. It means supporting the unions, it means halting privatization, it means... Yachimowicz is not really after handouts. That's not one of the orthodox parties. She's after structural changes, or the halting of structural changes in the economy. Do you think Netanyahu could ever become so desperate?
I think the scenario that you're outlining might actually take place sooner than a year down the road. And here we delve into the intra-party politics of Israel, but I think Yachimowicz, as the leader of the Labor, did not deliver on her promise in terms of electoral power. So when the primaries in the Labor took place in, October, I think, they were expecting a little over 20 representatives. Their power in the outgoing Knesset was 13. They had 13 representatives. What they were able to get 2 days ago was 15, which is a very minor gain, especially given the expectations and the fact that they had a list that was quite diverse. So they had the ability to attract people from of different types, of different sorts, and as you mentioned, their leader Yachimowicz put aside the Arab-Israeli conflict as an issue and tried to cater to the needs of the general population as it was reflected in the protests of 2011. All this essentially failed, or maybe failed is a bit extreme, but did not bear the
expectations.
Exactly. So I think, and to remind you, Yachimowicz has not been the leader since ever, and she is replaceable. So I think that her, and we need to remember that the Labor Party has traditionally, especially in the recent governments, have joined. This party has joined the Likud in leading the country with Barak. Barak was probably the most prominent example. So I think there is a chance that Yachimowicz will feel the pressure from within her own party to join the coalition. Maybe earlier than a year down the road. I think that there might be negotiations taking place as we speak. Not necessarily by the people of Yachimovich, but by members of this party. Because if you remember, this party was a part of the government, a part of the last government. So they've been working. They've collaborated with people from the Likud, and I think it's not unthinkable for them to do that again.
Another issue that Netanyahu mentioned in the recent days was electoral reform. This issue is being raised time and again, and for the sake of our non-Israeli viewers, and perhaps for the sake of Israeli viewers as well, I should note that Israel has experienced a very fragmented parliament throughout its existence, and ever more so with the years, as party loyalty has become a more fluid thing. It used to be the days where people would vote for the same party throughout their lives, came whatever, come what may. But that's no longer the truth, perhaps only with the exception of the Orthodox and Likud parties. And so there is, as we see in this election, there's great change in the political map, and governments failed to complete their 4-year terms time and again. And even if they do manage to stay a long period in office, they're still very sensitive to the demands of various coalition partners, and they're having to compromise all the time on their policy, and that is very bad for consistency and coherence of policy. Some suggestions for reform has been floated throughout the years. Israel went through a period in the late 1990s and early 2000s of a directly elected prime minister, but the way the laws were designed then made the parliament even more fragmented than it was, and so Ariel Sharon put an end to this system in the early 2000s. Another suggestion is to raise the entry threshold to the Knesset. Currently, it is 2%, 2.1. So I'm concerned that if they raised the threshold again, this would kick out some of the Arab parties from parliament. They would be first in line, as they're the smallest parties. One would argue that the Arabs could unite into one party that would still make it, but their politics is also very fractious, so it's not clear that even for that sake they would unite. And so Israel may end up with a Knesset that has no representation for Arabs. You, at that point, might think that the Jewish parties would find more seats for Arab people among their ranks to prevent that, but that's not guaranteed in any way. Do you think this is a policy that Netanyahu would like to push? What does he have in his mind, do you think, when he says electoral reform?
So I can't really answer the question what Netanyahu has in mind, because if he was very early on in his career, if he was elected, if you ask the same question in 1996 when he was elected prime minister for the first time, then he would probably have in mind something along the lines of other leaders such as de Gaulle and others, where they wanted to secure their position as chief executive and therefore increase the powers and the authority of the chief executive. It seems I doubt that this would be on top as a major issue on his agenda as far as the government reform is concerned, and. So you mentioned the issue with the government reform in the sense that the prime minister would be elected directly, and this will probably not be repeated, or this mistake, we should say, should not be repeated, because it really fractured the Israeli party system. But there's also proposals related to electoral reform in the sense that maybe something along the lines of the German system, where so for the purposes of elections in Israel, the entire country is a constituency, very different from the United States and many European countries. And at least one of the proposals is to allow for part of the parliament to be elected by by the country as a whole as a constituency, and another part to be elected by constituencies that are assigned to certain regions of the country. This might solve the problem that you mentioned with raising the threshold, because even if the threshold is relatively high, if there's a list system for the country as a whole, but there is a regional system as well, then you would probably have Arab representatives from places such as Haifa or Wadi Ara or Yafo, so where you have Arab citizens living. Of course, then you get into...
Even if under a Jewish party banner.
Even if under a Jewish party banner. Of course, then you get into the muddy waters of gerrymandering, which our American audience is very well familiar with. But I think maybe even just for the sake of the perception of Israel in the eyes of the international community, which you addressed earlier on in your presentation, I think it would be necessary to have fair representation of the Arab constituency. So maybe this one would be a solution. But any of the...
So it seems that we had a bit of a technical problem. I kept taking a look at the screen here to see if there are any questions coming on, and none came. So we kept on, but it seemed that there are questions after all. We have a question: what happened to social democracy in Israel, and is ideology dead? Well, that's a very fair and very interesting question. Ideology is clearly not dead as far as the right of the political map is concerned. They're very determined and very convinced. Ideology is definitely not dead there. Therefore, Eretz Yisrael Hashlema, the entirety of the biblical land, and that's one ideology at least. If we look at the center, if the question is more directed at the center of politics, then I would say Labor has not had an idealist leader in quite a while. Sheli Yachimowicz was a very ardent socialist. She said that time and again, that she is a socialist without hyphenation. She's a socialist. And that she's fighting capitalism. And she kept talking in this way even in her election night speech. So clearly ideology, even there, is not dead in the political economic sphere, nor in the foreign policy sphere. Do you agree?
I think that at least, if we think about how those elections reflect what happened in the summer of 2011 here, I think ideology, at least some ideological aspects, are a little tired. Not dead, but they're a little tired. So people are a little tired with what used to be as you mentioned, the main issue that determined the ideological spectrum in Israel, which was the Arab-Israeli conflict. So people are a little tired with that. Doesn't mean that the conflict is solved, as we all know. It's still alive, but people feel that their needs, and again, maybe this has to do more with what I talked about at the very beginning. Their needs as having young children, having young families with kitchen table issues, childcare, affordable housing. These are the things that concern them more than the big grand issues of the conflict, etc. So those kitchen table issues are related to ideology, but I don't think people, at least in some, let's say the constituencies that voted for those centrist parties, which determined the outcome of the elections, we should say, those voters, I think they are a little tired on ideology.
I should also note the electoral success of Meretz, which more than doubled its number of seats. And they are normally regarded as idealists with a liberal bias. So ideology didn't die, but it failed to capture the main center ground. I would say that. Another question we have here is the fact that Shelley failed to achieve her goals to do with her being a woman and the inability to accept a woman PM? You want to give this a go? By the way, I apologize, but none of us are women.
Nothing to apologize for. This is how we were born. I should be very careful here.
Yeah, you should be.
Yeah. I think the labor, notwithstanding the gender of its leader, was not a strong candidate to lead the country after those elections. If we think about those elections in gender terms, we could say that there is a clear distinction between the center-left and the right. So the leaders of the center-left parties, the dominant center-left parties, were all women. So you mentioned Meretz, and their leader is Zahava Gal'on. We talked about Yechimovic, which the question addressed, woman leading the Labour Party, and Hatnuah, which I mentioned briefly earlier, which is led by Tzipi Livni, the former foreign minister. On the right, this is not the case. So the leaders, and I would say in large part the prominent figures in the parties on the right, are all men. I don't know if it's... I think it's a little premature to make any statement about that, but at least as far as the descriptive statistics are concerned, there is a clear difference here between the left wing and the right wing parties.
I should note that in the previous election in 2009, Tzipi Livni came first. It was amazing how Kadima, the party she led then, made the transition from the incapacitating of Sharon, how he had to retire, through Olmert's leadership to Tzipi Livni. She won the greatest number of seats back then. The reason she could not form a coalition was that there weren't enough partners for her policy of pursuing peace or some settlements with the Palestinians, and so that never worked out. But in spite of the fact that Shelley did not win, I don't think she didn't win because she was a woman. She did not win because she was a very uncompromising ideologue, and that won her some enthusiastic support among some people, but at the same time scared away those who thought she was too serious about her ideology, and that kind of frightened some people. But that was not because she was a woman. And I would, as far as women representation in politics, I agree that I would draw comfort from the results in this election, not only by the leadership of the parties, but also when you look at their lists. Who's in the Knesset? I haven't counted the women, but it seems on first sight like there were many new young women in the Knesset. And these are...
They say you're 26 women representatives.
All right. So, yeah. So that's what, like 20, yeah, 20%. And these are also normally, or most of them are very young too, and very active. So we can expect them to be very active in legislative processes. They're not kind of party machine women, and so I think actually this should be seen as a development in the right direction as far as promotion of women participation in politics is concerned.
Can I have to say two more things?
All right.
Let me say two more brief comments. One about gender and one about ideology, which seems to interest our audience. So as far as gender is concerned, I was thinking you were going to say, the transition that the Kadima party went through between 2005 or 6 and 2009. I thought you were going to talk about gender, because I think the transition in terms of gender is staggering. You have Ariel Sharon, the most male general figure that seems to be able to lead the party to a huge success. And then, due to his medical condition, and Olmert due to certain legal issues, those two prominent figures, male figures, are gone. And there's a woman leader who is identified as quite hawkish, although she is also identified as the one leading the peace process, but also she comes from a from a family that is very hawkish, etc. And she is able to lead the party to a brilliant success in 2009. So this, I think, also is a very interesting transition as far as gender is concerned. And let me say just one more thing about ideology. I think this elections are, I think the general gist of things in Israel in the last few years, there's a lot of pragmatism in the air. Okay, so what we talked here about the sharing the burden, for instance, okay, the fact that at least some of the initiative for this might come actually from the ultra-religious constituency. If you think about one example, he never passed the threshold, okay, but he was relatively strong. Amsalem, okay, Harav Amsalem, who used to be in the Shas party, left the party, and he had some initiatives in some sense quite similar to Lapid's party, or maybe even Meretz as far as this issue is concerned, and he comes from an ultra-Orthodox Mizrahi group. So I think, and he is very pragmatic, right? There's nothing about ideology.
He presented himself as the pub-going ultra-Orthodox.
Yeah. But I think he's just a symbol, but I think this sense of pragmatism was in the air, and it might replace ideology, at least for some people.
Okay, our time is up. Thank you for joining us on this evening for this webcast at Tel Aviv University on the outcomes of the 2013 Israeli elections. Dr. Sommer, thank you very much for having us.
It was a pleasure.
And from me, Tal Sadeh, thank you for joining us. Have a good night.